So we're going to do a little bit more on ancient Greece and talk about a couple of texts of Plato's, and I'll start with the Apology. But before I get into that, I want to give you just sort of a really quick primer on Greek philosophy. I've given you a little bit of ancient Greek history in the Antigone lecture, so let's talk a little bit about philosophy, because philosophy is kind of different. So I have just a quick couple of slides about how to think and talk about philosophy. Philosophy is a discipline that has many different fields within it. So one question or one set of fields within philosophy is the field of metaphysics. And metaphysics is just a really fancy way of saying that we're studying the nature of reality. What exists, what doesn't exist. You often see ontology brought into this, and that's just the study of the nature of being. So anyone who studies metaphysics will ask the following questions: what does exist? What doesn't exist in the world? What propositions are true? Do space and time exist? How many things are there in the universe? How much stuff is out there? And then a seemingly weird question that goes with all that stuff is the question of free will. I don't really want to take the time to explain that, but that is a metaphysical question. So another field of philosophy is the field of epistemology, and that's where we study the nature of knowledge and justified belief. So the epistemologist will ask questions like, is knowledge actually possible? Can we know anything at all? Well, where does our knowledge come from? How do we know what we know? What's the justification for our knowledge? Is it evidence? Is it, senses? What are the limits of knowledge? How much can we know? So value theory is another field within philosophy, and that includes ethics, social philosophy, political philosophy, it includes aesthetics. The ethicist will ask and answer questions like, how should we live? What does the good life mean? That's really important for us as we go through Module 2. How do we treat others? Do we have obligations to other people? What's the right thing to do in a situation? What's the wrong thing to do? Where does our morality come from? The social and political philosophers will focus on laws and justice and governance. What kind of government is best? What kind of laws are best? And what does justice mean? And someone who studies aesthetics will answer questions like, what is beautiful and what is not beautiful? So, philosophy in Western civilization has a really rich tradition that we can trace back to the ancient Greeks. And so one of the things that I'll go back to a little bit is our discussion of, when we talked about early civilizations, we talked about people trying to understand the world around them. And so we had like creation stories, cosmogonies and cosmologies, curiosity about the universe, and we kind of constructed that discussion in terms of like a pre-scientific context. So the explanations that we encountered were not what we would call scientific explanations. So they were based on spiritual beliefs. So the creation stories from the book of Genesis would be an example of something that's not based on scientific evidence, but is based on spiritual beliefs. So once we get to the ancient Greeks, especially beginning with the pre-Socratics, we see early scientific inquiry and people coming up with explanations that don't rest on spiritual beliefs, but on empirical evidence, experiments, and stuff like that. So the pre-Socratics are a wide and varied group of philosophers that the name just means before Socrates, although that's actually kind of misleading because, even though we don't have as many writings of theirs, they're still quite important. And in many cases, the pre-Socratics didn't just stop writing when Socrates was alive. In some cases, we're talking about contemporaneous schools of thought. So there are basically three categories that we're looking at here: the cosmologists, the mathematicians, and the sophists. The cosmologists are the ones who try to explain the basic structure of the universe. So these are the proto-scientists. Thales, pictured here, is one of them, and each one of these people is looking for like the building block of the universe. So Thales says everything is water, right? Another guy says, Anaxagoras says everything is mind. Anaximander says everything is indefinite. Heraclitus says everything is flux, right? So you've got all of these people giving their own theories about what the basic foundational building block of the universe is. And so that's the cosmologists. On the other hand, you have the mathematicians, who we split up into basically two groups, the Pythagoreans and the Parmenideans. The Pythagoreans thought that the basic building block of the universe was number, right? Math, and that just means that mathematical principles guide everything in the world. This is something that you see with Galileo too. I think in the scientific revolution, we kind of come back full circle around to this. The Parmenideans had this view of reality that is totally static, and so reality is unchanging. And so here's a picture of Pythagoras sitting in his book, and I think that's Averroes looking over his shoulder from Raphael's School of Athens. And then finally you have the Sophists. And these people are especially, like, they're around when Socrates is around. And they're actually more concerned with ethics, and rhetoric. So you would say that the three interests of the Sophists are humanism, relativism, and rhetoric. Humanism is the belief that humans have a special place in the universe. So like Protagoras says that man is the measure of all things. Relativism means that there's no objective truth. And so the Sophists are going to employ the power of argument to convince people that there basically is no ultimate right or wrong answer. And so relativism and rhetoric go hand in hand. Okay, so we've talked about the pre-Socratics, and now I want to talk a little more specifically about Plato and Socrates. So two of the most important figures in all of ancient Greek philosophy are Plato and Socrates. All we know of Socrates is what has been written about him, because he didn't actually write anything down in his lifetime. So all we have are secondhand accounts of Socrates. And most of what we know about Socrates comes through Plato's dialogues. Plato's Socrates' student. And when Socrates died, Plato constructed a school called the Academy, and he started, compiling the things that Socrates taught into dialogues. Most of what Plato wrote was dialogues. Although the first thing we read is not a dialogue, it's a speech, it's the apology. And in a dialogue, what we're dealing with basically are characters, who we refer to as interlocutors, who talk through a philosophical problem together. And I'll give you an example of this in a second. So what you see, I would say, like, probably half the time are whatever Socrates says, that's what Plato's view is. So Plato's own views get represented by the voice of Socrates in the dialogue. So we can kind of see Plato as like, or Socrates as like speaking for Plato as this mouthpiece. So whenever someone talks about the Socratic method, this is something you've probably heard of before. In philosophy, we tend to refer to it either as like the dialectical method, or if you want to take the Greek version, that's just the Elenchus. And so here's the way that the Socratic method works. First, Socrates asks a question. And it's a really broad question, like, what is justice? Or what is love? Or what is piety? Or should we care what other people think about us? And that's the example we'll see in the Crito. And so the person who's talking to Socrates is going to give an answer, such as justice is always repaying our debts, or we should care what others think about us because public opinion is valuable, or something like that. Okay, so Socrates takes that information, and then he always gives a counterexample. So if we go back to the question of justice, and you say, well, justice is repaying one's debts. Socrates says, okay, so let me give you an example of you borrowing a weapon from a friend, and the friend asks that you return his weapon, but you actually are really suspicious, and you think your friend is in like a depressive episode, and you think that he might want to hurt himself with his weapon if you return it. In that situation, you wouldn't say it would be just to return your friend's weapon because your friend would harm himself. So justice cannot just be repaying one's debt. debts. Therefore, we just need a better definition of justice. So the conversation goes on and on and on like this. And so, Socrates says, this can't be the definition. Give me another one. And so the interlocutor says, well, justice is this. And then Socrates knocked that one down. And it just goes on and on and on until Socrates gets an answer that he's happy with. But actually, usually he doesn't even get an answer. So we'll see the dialectic in action when we read the Crito. And so I'm going to talk about the Apology next, and I'll save some of that discussion for our next chat about Plato.